We've got 2 attendees. All right.
Thanks for those who are joining us. We'll just give it a couple of minutes, then we'll get ourselves underway.
So Pete,
Yes.
don't start it yet. We've only got 3 attendees.
All right.
I think we should wait until we've actually got some numbers.
Okay.
So for the 3 attendees who have already joined us, thanks for coming along. We are going to wait until we get a few more people in the meeting before we get proceedings going. So if you can just wait a little while, think about what questions you might want to ask the panel. So we've got 4 attendees, but I still think it would be nice to have a few more people in the room before we get it started. So I encourage people to sit tight for a little bit longer. Okay, we're getting a few more numbers coming in now. We'll keep waiting. So Pete, why don't we, at 11:05, which is going to be in a minute, maybe we'll run the video then. We've got
Sounds good.
6 people at the moment. Be nice to get a few more.
Okay, I'll run this one now.
Okay, thanks, Pete. So if you want to make a real impact in the world and you want to develop skills that make you very employable, then you might want to think about studying environment issues. Environment issues are core to a lot of the important challenges around the world. Challenges in how we feed people, how we have sustainable cities, how we manage bushfire, how we manage climate change, and so on. And it's a great opportunity to study environment issues at the ANU, because the ANU has the Fenner School of Environment and Society. And the Fenner School, we recognise that environment issues have got that dimension to do with the plants and the animals and the trees and the soil and so on, but they always also have a human dimension. That's the society part. And we bring both of those elements to anything we study. We have leading researchers in the school that are making a big difference in the world themselves, but also play a role in teaching the courses that we teach. So if you're really passionate about environment, we've got a degree just for you called the Bachelor's in Environment and Sustainability. And that's a course that focuses in the Fenner School but has opportunities in other schools. But actually, you might be more interested in doing a Bachelor of Science or Arts, or you might want to study law or politics and still bring some environmental perspectives into one of those degrees. And this approach is possible too. It's really easy if you're doing a Bachelor of Science to choose plenty of environment subjects and mix them up with a few others. But even those other degrees have generally got the flexibility to bring in courses from other schools. And we love having these students in our environment courses too. Either of these options are great, and the ANU is a great place to be doing them. I hope you think about studying environment at the ANU. Okay, thanks for running that, Pete. So welcome everybody to an event in ANU's virtual Open Week. So this one is coming to you from the Fenner School of Environment and Society, and the topic is on managing bushfires. Just a few proceedings issues. So the webinar is going to be recorded, and the recording will be made available after the event, and there'll be a link to the recording on the main ANU Virtual Open Week website. The idea for this session is you'll hear from some experts, all of who work on bushfire related issues, but you'll also have a chance for Q&A. So Q&A with the experts here about bushfire issues, but also possibly just about education issues in the Fenner School. All that's open. And the way to do that will be through the Q&A function. So if you move your mouse, you should find down the bottom, there's a Q&A tab. So put your questions into that Q&A box, and you can put them in at any time, and then I'll read them out when the time's right. That should work for you. If that's not working for you, you can try the chat box, but I think the Q&A is the way to go. Okay, and also before we get started, I want to acknowledge any First Nations people who might be joining us today, and acknowledge that we're coming from Canberra, or all of the virtual panelists here are in Canberra, which means that we're on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. So we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging of those people. Okay, so with that, we're going to go around the panel of experts and ask each of them to introduce themselves, and then we'll ask a few questions about bushfire, and then we'll be open to all the questions from the audience. So can I ask first, I'm going to start with Geoff Cary. would you like to tell the audience a few words about you and your work?
Sure, thanks Saul. I'm Geoff Cary, Associate Director in Bushfire Science in the Fenner School of Environment Society here at ANU. I teach and research in bushfire environmental science, bushfire behaviour and computer modelling of bushfires. Talk a little bit more about that research later. I'm a member of the Editorial Advisory Board for the International Journal of Wildland Fire, which is a key journal in our bushfire field. And I currently sit on the Federal Science Minister's Bushfire Science Roundtable. I've been lucky enough to work and visit and think about bushfires in China, Japan, the USA, Canada, various countries in Europe, and of course in Australia and New Zealand. And so looking forward to a really exciting discussion about bushfires. Thanks, Saul.
Great, thanks, Geoff. Marta, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, sure. I'm Marta Yebra. I got a joint appointment as a senior lecturer in environment and engineering with the Fenner School of Environment and Society, but also the Research School of Aerospace, Mechanical and Environmental Engineering, and CAF. And under this appointment, I researched on the use of remote sensing data, so data collected by sensors that don't directly touch the target variable, and remote sensing technology to support bushfire management activities, and also make sure that this research is present in the teaching curriculum at the ANU. So I am also a mission specialist at the ANU Institute for Space, where I support ANU Earth observation initiatives to develop new opportunities for cross-disciplinary collaboration with the global space industry.
Great, thanks, Marta. And it's interesting then to think about the fact that managing bushfires can include research that's space-oriented. So thanks for that. Phil Gibbons, can you introduce yourself?
So hello everybody, I'm Phil Gibbons, also from the Fenner School. After I graduated, I was a park ranger, and as a park ranger you also become a firefighter. So I did firefighting in East Gippsland and in Victoria. And while doing that, you realise where the information gaps are in the way we fight fires and manage the environment. And that sort of sparked an interest in me. So I returned and became a researcher. I did a PhD and became a researcher. And now I'm working here at ANU and also am a teach in the conservation and land management space as well. But a pivotal moment for me, Saul, was was when I was in Victoria during the Black Saturday fires, which was in 2009, and they were phenomenal fires. You know, over 2,000 houses destroyed, 173 people killed, and I realised I had the experience and I had the skills. And that really pushed me into the fire research area. So I've been studying how we manage land to reduce house losses during bushfires in Australia ever since.
And isn't it interesting to reflect that when those fires happened in Victoria, they were seen as, the worst that we could imagine. And here we are sometime later and we've had a fire season that was more destructive than that one.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's interesting, you know, we've got all these aircraft, we've got better, huge helicopters, we've got better weather forecasting, improved fire science, and yet the number of houses destroyed during bushfires in Australia is actually still increasing. So, so we've still got a lot of challenges ahead.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Phil. David, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thanks, Saul, and hello, everyone. My name's David Lindenmayer. I'm a professor of forest ecology, conservation science at the Fenner School. And my area of research really pivots around very long-term, very large-scale studies, including the wet forests of Victoria and the heathlands and forests and woodlands of coastal southeastern Australia, particularly around Jervis Bay and Budaree National Park, and Beecroft military training area to the northern side of the bay. But in every one of our large-scale long-term studies, fire is really important. And I think unless you're working on shorebirds, virtually every part of terrestrial Australia is affected by fire to some extent. So we work in areas to do with how fires affect biodiversity, but also how ecosystems respond after fire. And we're looking at interactions between, for example, how ecosystems burn and the impacts of feral animals and particularly herbivores after ecosystems are damaged. But we also look at interactions between fire and climate change, fire and land management, such as forestry, and also fire and resource availability. And in more recent times, we've started to work with Indigenous communities looking at the potential of cultural burning to look at fuel risk of property damage, those kinds of things. So some very interesting dimensions, which is really very much about where the Fenner School is at, looking at multiple dimensions of problems and solving issues that often need really important breakthrough science to look at things in a different way.
Thanks, David. And look, I can't remember if I introduced myself or not, but I'll introduce myself now. So my name's Saul Cunningham. I'm the director of the Fenner School, which means I work with all of these folk, which is a real privilege. I'm not a bushfire researcher myself, but like anyone else in Australia, I think about bushfire, I see bushfire, and I'm concerned about what it means to live with bushfire. And I suppose the particular issues in my own research that are I would link to fire are more around conservation management. So I've got an interest in how we preserve biodiversity, both in wild landscapes, but also in managed landscapes. And of course, as with almost any land management issue in Australia, there's a fire management dimension to those kinds of questions. Okay, so with that, I'll ask a few questions which really anyone on the panel can tackle. It'd be nice to hear a little bit from each of you. And I'm going to start with a general question about, can someone offer a bit of an overview of the role that fire plays in the Australian environment, both on people and on other elements of the environment?
Sure, so maybe I can start with just a couple of points to set up a framework, because I know that all of us work on many aspects of the question you just asked. So, I mean, I think we all know fire is pivotal to the functioning of Australian ecosystems, and it's hugely impactful on all of us in Australian society. So you mentioned before the current or the recent fire season, the 2019-2020 fire season. You know, in eastern and southern Australia, you know, more than 10 million hectares of forests were burned, although that number has been revised by some of the excellent work by Marta Yebra on this panel and others, just published in the prestigious journal Nature. Around 35 direct fatalities, but a lot of also indirect fatalities through related to smoke, and the destruction of over 3,500 houses. And I know Phil Gibbons on this panel will talk more about our research looking at land management factors affecting house loss in bushfires. Natural systems, forest systems, grasslands and woodlands begin the process of recovery immediately after bushfires, and the nature of this recovery depends on the types of plant species and how they regenerate after fire, whether they resprout immediately from the stem and branches or the roots perhaps, or they require to germinate from seed and require a longer interval between two successive fires. As this vegetation changes, the habitat for animals is changing, and this means that different groups of birds and mammals and reptiles will be found at different times since the most recent fire. And as I indicated earlier, all of us are working on various aspects of this. And so there's a few points to set a framework, and maybe I'll pass over to others.
Yes, perhaps just to add to that is that fire has been part of Australia for many years, and yeah, it's been shaping all these processes that Geoff has mentioned. But I think over the last year, what we've been experiencing is more frequent and more severe fire seasons, and last fire season was an example of that. And some of the research I do around monitoring vegetation condition, for example, told us that the forests were so dry during the last fire season. Looking at satellite data, we showed that the fuel loads were very high and the fuels were very dry. So that had a very dry landscape that was one of the drivers of the severity of the fire season. And this explains why the area of forest that was burned last fire season was a lot higher than the average we've seen in the last 18 years of satellite data we've got.
Can I just add something there? Yeah, it's often you see what Marta said is so true. You know, Australia is, fire is integral to the Australian landscape, and a lot of things have evolved to actually respond to fire. And yet you often see in the media, you know, the term, you know, fire's destroyed X number of hectares, and sometimes fire is absolutely necessary for some things to regenerate, or as Geoff said, you know, some areas with recent fire are important for some of our Australian wildlife. But it's those changes, isn't it, Marta, you know, that we're seeing, you know, it's the frequency of fires, the area of fires, the severity, they're things that are changing. And when it comes to infrastructure, you know, obviously we've become more constrained as Australia has grown and our population has grown. We've started to build things in the landscape that our flexibility with fire has been constrained somewhat, you know. So now you can't, if a fire's coming, you can't just move your house, or, you know, you've got to really embark upon severe management. And then even things like prescribed burning can be difficult. If you've got fences near your house, you've got stock grazing near your house, you know, it becomes a real challenge to manage fire in Australia's modern landscape.
I often think about fire in terms of Goldilocks. So not too much, not too little for many species. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in more recent times is that large parts of Australia are burning far more extensively and far more frequently than they should be. So, for example, in northeastern Victoria, with the fires we've just had in 2019 and 20, we had areas that have now burnt 3 or 4 times in 25 years, when in fact, those areas should not be burning more than about once every 50 to 75 years. So things are really changing, and changing in quite concerning ways. And so we're going to need really good science and really good thinkers to be able to intervene in this area and think about how we're going to solve some of these problems.
So Phil used a language a moment ago of prescribed burning, and I was sort of thinking it might be good to talk about that. And I've actually got a question from one of the audience here saying, "Hi guys, I'd love to hear your take on preventative measures like fire stick farming and firewood collection." So I think that fits the conversation pretty well. I'll open that up to anyone who might want to comment on those tools as preventive measures.
I think that part of the response there is that the validity of some of these things, like fire stick farming, will be very dependent on what systems you're dealing with. So some of the very wet forests and the temperate rainforests and the subtropical rainforests are not places that are really geared to deal with very frequent lower severity fire. In fact, you could, if you burn those systems too frequently, you might lose them altogether. The other thing that's really important here is that the notion of cultural burning, fire stick farming, those kinds of things, I think is a really fascinating one, but there's actually very little empirical data at this stage to support them. So I think there's a really exciting opportunity here to start to mesh Western science with the approaches to fire management that Indigenous people have had, but do it in a culturally appropriate way. So we're not misappropriating Indigenous intellectual property that's happened in the past. So I think there's some important things to be done in this space. And
while, good that you mentioned that, David, I was teaching last week in a course that would be open to any of these potential ANU students here. And we were having in fact, fire was the topic of discussion, and our speaker was Biami Williamson, who's an academic at the ANU, who used to work with ACT Parks. He was involved in the Marambung Rangers, who I know have worked with Geoff Cary's course. So it might be good to talk a little bit about the way we have worked with Indigenous burning in our teaching and in our research. Geoff, do you want to pick that up in your course?
Sure, Saul, and it's nice to talk about teaching so early in the program. I think we might come back a little bit later on in this session and give an overview of our bushfire curriculum, which we're all involved in the Fenner School. But picking up on this particular, and it's a great question, thanks to the participant. We work with the Murrumbung Rangers, who are a group of local Aboriginal people who are also professional rangers working in places like the ACT Parks and Conservation Service. And there are other groups around the country that are similar, but I think the ACT Murrumbung Ranger group is an excellent example of how this can work. In our teaching, in our advanced fire course, which is called Fire and the Environment, we spend half a day or more out with the Murrumbung Rangers looking at the landscape through Indigenous and Aboriginal eyes and thinking about reinterpreting the firescape through that perspective. And the Murrumbung Rangers are expert lecturers in our course who talk about the sorts of cultural burning programs, Saul, that you and David were referring to, but they talk about it from a deep understanding and knowledge from generations, from millennia of knowledge as well. And it's important, and picking up on David's point, to understand that cultural burning is not just low intensity burning in the landscape, which is sometimes the way it's talked about. It's cultural burning undertaken for very important cultural reasons by Aboriginal people on Aboriginal country. And we go out and learn that and experience that sort of information and insight, if you like, which can only be learned from Aboriginal people in our courses. So I think Aboriginal burning, or cultural burning, I should say, has a really important future in the future of fire management in Australia. And there was a dedicated session on that in the recent Royal Commission to the National Response to Natural Disasters. And Bayomi Exford-Williams was part of that, and he's also a graduate of one of our ANU fire courses. Thanks.
Thanks, Geoff. One of the other components of this question here was about firewood collection, and I just wanted to pick up on that one. And I'd happy to hear from other panelists, but we've certainly done research on the role of both standing dead trees and on fallen timber as habitat for lots of different fauna. So we know that there's fauna and flora, actually. There's plants that will live in and around fallen timber. We know that there's a lot of plants and animals that depend on the presence of wood in the landscape, wood that we as humans might call firewood. So this is an area where you would expect there to be a real tension between what you might want to do to manage flora and fauna and what you might want to do to manage property to manage the risk to property from bushfire. So we certainly wouldn't want to encourage widespread firewood collecting as a preventative for bushfire, because we know that the biodiversity impact of that would be terrible. What I don't know, and maybe someone here can tell us, is would it be very helpful on the fire management front? Phil?
Could I just add to that, Saul? So thanks, Liam, for the question. It's interesting, that the severity, when a bushfire comes through, the severity of that fire is maintained by fuel less than 6 millimeters diameter. So really, no wider than about your finger, because if you think of when you light a campfire, you use kindling and that gets it going, and then the bigger logs you throw in and they smolder away. So those big logs, that people use for firewood actually don't contribute to the severity of our bushfires. They might smolder afterwards, and but they don't contribute to the severity of fires. So actually, they're not by increasing firewood harvesting, you're not really dealing with the issue of fire severity. And as Saul said, it is true that coarse woody debris or logs on the ground are really important for a number of species. We've done work in Namadgi National Park that shows that those logs are really important for a range of reptiles in particular, also some mammals. So yes, it's not really an area that we're going to get, you could potentially do a lot of harm to the environment, and you're not really addressing the core issue. And can I also add something about prescribed burning? It's interesting that you would think that prescribed burning is very well researched. It's a topical issue after major fires, but in actual fact, the links between prescribed burning and, for instance, house loss are pretty thin on the ground. And so we've been doing work after Black Saturday, and now we've looked at 13 of the last really big wildfires and looked at how prescribed burning can be done to minimise impacts on house losses. And there's some interesting outcomes that we presented to the Royal Commission, and Geoff and I, I helped Geoff in his course with that information as well. So all the students who come through the Fenner School get exposed to that sort of cutting edge research on prescribed burning.
Thanks, Phil. At some point, actually, I want to go to Marta and talk about how we can understand fuel loads from space. But before we go there, we've actually got one on the Q&A channel. So someone has asked, are ecosystems adapting because of increasing fire seasons? So maybe David, would you like to comment on if we see evidence of ecosystems adapting to this change in fires?
Some species are not doing so well, sadly. So even some of the tree species that would normally resprout after fires. So there are hormonal changes inside trees when you burn the canopy, which trigger some tree species to resprout from the trunk or even at the root base. There's some evidence that with such frequent fire, some of those species are simply not doing terribly well, and perhaps not even resprouting at all. But there are some species that do really well and change incredibly quickly. So one of those is this remarkable, aptly named flame robin. It's a wonderful bird, quite a small creature. And I don't know how this works, and nobody really knows how this works, but after extensive fires, for example, the 2009 fires, places where you would never see flame robins were suddenly colonised. Outside of the breeding season, we'd have literally millions of birds inhabiting large parts of central Victoria that had just been burnt in the Black Saturday fires. So there must be some inherent adaptation processes taking place in some of these areas. And other animals are doing the same. Some of the jewel beetles, that extraordinary, beautiful, small beetle species, are actually attracted to smoke through the remarkable appendages on their bodies to detect smoke. So some things do really well, some things not so well. And one of the key things in the research area is to work out which ones are going to do okay and which ones are not, and what to do about those ones that aren't going to travel so well.
And maybe this gets back to your Goldilocks point that it's not that fire is something we want to completely exclude from the landscape. It's something we want to maintain in the landscape. We just don't want it to spread so widely that obviously we don't want the impacts on people, but we also don't want our environments to be dominated by the fire adapted environments. We want a mix of both, I think. So
that's correct. The big loss in Northern Australia is long unburnt country.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem with mammal declines in the north, and that's starting to happen likewise in Southern Australia as well. Mm. And we need to think about how biodiversity connects with some of these things. We've had that discussion about logs and species, but the species themselves can be really important. So your average lyrebird with those enormous feet, it's not only singing in the forest to make it a beautiful place to be, those enormous feet are turning over 200 tonnes of leaf litter and small materials every year. And that's, as Phil says, a key part of the sort of the fire fuels in those systems. So a really critical role as a decomposer of material in the forest.
So thanks for that. Now, we've talked a little bit about fuel. You know, Phil made that point about the very fine kind of twigs and so on that contribute to fuel more than logs. And David was just talking about the forest floor fuel. Marta, I know that in your research, you use remote sensing to understand both how much fuel there is and how dry it is. Can you talk about how we can do that from space?
Yes, sure. So we have some satellites orbiting the Earth and collecting imagery. And what we do is to convert those raw measurements that normally it is a kind of reflectance, solar energy reflectance that is bouncing back to the sensor. We run some algorithms to convert it into information that is useful for fire managers. And this includes, as Sol said, fuel moisture content. And we can also retrieve the three-dimensional structure of a forest and how much fuel load it is. And all these components are part of the landscape flammability. So how likelihood is a fire to occur if there is an ignition source. And therefore it's very important to inform many management decisions. For example, when to plan a prescribed burn. We've been talking about prescribed burning, so we need to know when is the best timing, so the fuel is not too dry, so the fire may go out of control very easily, or it is too wet, so you will not be able to ignite it at all, or it will not sustain for the period of time the managers want the fire to burn. So yes, so this is basically what you can get for fire management planning. You can also use satellite data to assess the impacts of fires. You can, after the fire, you can use satellite data to know how much, what was the extent of the fire and what was the severity of the fire. And this is because the landscape burn at different fire severities have a very different spectral response. So the way the vegetation bounces back the energy from the sun is different depending on of how it was burned or how much content, water content the vegetation have, and all these factors.
So Marta, we know that the summer that we just went through was the worst for bushfire in southeastern Australia that we're aware of, or that we've lived through. Did your work with satellite remote sensing information, did you predict that it was going to be pretty bad?
Well, in November, we were seeing moisture content values that were well below the average. We've been seeing over the last 18 years of satellite records. So that was telling us that, the flammability of the forest was quite high. So it was pretty much ready to be burned as soon as there was an ignition source, and burned very hot and for many days. Yeah.
So in that case, our failure to respond wasn't because we didn't know it was coming. It was something to do with our inability to put the systems in place to respond. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, it is a fair comment, I think. Yes.
And we know, as I was coming into work this morning, I was listening to the news about the fires in California. So, we know that California has some similarities with Eastern Australia in terms of proneness to bushfires. Was it to be expected that California would have a bad year this year? Do you know?
Yeah, probably it's the same story. Yeah, the weather is getting hotter, and the fires with the days with fire danger are getting extended, and this is happening in Australia, but also overseas, like in countries as California. So, yeah, unfortunately, we are expecting the seasons that start earlier and burn for longer.
Yeah. Okay.
So could I add there that we do because of the similarities between places like California and Australia, that a lot of us collaborate with people from California in our research and share our research, go backwards and forth between the places. So it's a really good exchange and collaboration that happens between the Fenner School and various institutions in that part of the United States.
Yeah, that's great.
So all I can just briefly add, following on from Phil's there, and one of the areas that we do research and we haven't talked about much yet in the Fenner School in bushfires is computer simulation modelling. We ignite and burn bushfires inside computers according to everything we understand in terms of fire weather, fuel dynamics, ignition patterns and terrain. And we think about the effects of prescribed burning, as Phil talked about before, and also climate change in terms of determining the extent of fires in landscapes. And we've done some joint work with people in the USA and Canada and Europe, where we've taken 5 landscape fire models from around the world and conducted sort of simultaneous experiments where we've made the climate warmer and discovered, indicated that across all of these landscapes around, many of these fire-prone landscapes around the world, we would expect to see greater extents burned by bushfires or wildfires if you're in North America as the climate warms around the planet.
Thanks, Geoff. We've actually got a question in from one of the attendees. It's from Liam, and it's directed to Marta, but there might be some comment from others. So, is it real-time data? the data you're collecting, and therefore do landowners have access to that information to help their decision making for burn-offs if they've got large properties?
Yes, sure. It really depends on which data we are talking about. So, for example, one of the tools we have developed, and Geoff Cary has been part of the research team, is the Australian flammability monitoring system. So this system provides information at near real time. So it's not real time, but close to it. And yeah, it is publicly available to anybody that wants to use it. And indeed, there are some private landowners that have started to use it just to inform for their bushfire plans and to help them to be prepared for the bushfire season, but to know how dry the fuel around their properties is.
Thanks, Marta. We've got another question on the Q&A. Well, it's a good idea. Are there study tours at ANU that go to California? Now, I think I can answer that at the moment we are not taking students to California. That's not something we've done recently, but we actually have had conversations with Californian institutions about reciprocal learning because of the commonality between California and Australia. I'm sorry to say that if you enroll at the ANU, which is something I encourage you to do, we can't yet promise you a trip to California. Does anyone else want to comment on the idea of a study tour to California and who might want to teach it?
It's a great idea, but it might be worth noting, Saul, that although we don't have currently trips to California, we have them to a lot of other places.
Yeah, good point. So not around fire so much, but the two international field schools that we currently have, one is to Vietnam, and that happens in January, and that focuses on actually a really wide range of issues. It's almost whatever we find when we're there, but it inevitably is a lot about being in a rapidly developing country like Vietnam, a country with a really interesting history, with a pretty large population, and a lot of issues around water and agriculture, because one of the great river deltas is in the south of Vietnam, and we spend some time in that part of Vietnam learning about how they farm and how they live and what they eat and so on. So the Vietnam Field School is one. The other one is the Fiji Field School. That happens in July. And again, it focuses quite a lot on development issues, but there the context is in being in one of the most isolated, true island countries in the world. So what are the challenges that you face when you're in a country where any imported goods are coming by boat or aeroplane very long distances? It sets up really interesting challenges. Yeah, we talk about things like the fact that one of the largest brands of bottled water in the world is Fiji water. I think you can buy it in Australia. It certainly can be purchased in the US. This is water that's extracted from aquifers on the main island of Fiji, put in plastic bottles and sent to America to be drunk by people there. So, we look at issues like that and how we might respond to them. So yeah, certainly, and I should point out there's other international experiences across the ANU. So we're not the only school that offers those kinds of things. I think if you look at the websites, you'll find a really wide range of interesting opportunities, including some where we can facilitate your participation, even if it's not an ANU course. So one of the students I know well was in Indonesia in first semester this year. Unfortunately, she had to come back because of COVID. But just an example of one of the many overseas courses. So certainly having an international experience is something that ANU really supports.
And Saul, I encourage all my students to try to do, if they can, to do an exchange during their degree, because it just opens, it broadens their perspective. I think it's a wonderful thing. And we get a lot of students on exchange here, and they're all fantastic. They're all really enthusiastic. So we're straying from fire a little bit, but it was a great question.
Yeah, and actually there's a sort of a follow-up. Are these field trip subjects limited to undergrad, or are they open to postgrad as well? So I'll give a little bit of an answer, but then I'll throw it to others. There's certainly courses that have fieldwork in Australia. Many of our courses have a local fieldwork element, and many of our courses are open to both postgrad and undergrad. So the short answer is yes, you can do postgrad coursework at the Fenner School and have either a local or international field experience. But I'll ask people on the panel if they might want to add to that answer.
Yeah, Phil takes lots of students to the long-term work at Jarvis Bay, where they do wildlife response to fire and other things. And we have volunteers both in virtually all of our projects in different parts of southeastern Australia. So that really enriches their experience, but it also helps them connect with people who may be potential employers as time goes on. Yeah,
that's true. And Geoff, you teach a field, you teach a fire intensive that I believe has local kind of field work. Do you want to comment on what that looks like and whether or not postgrad students are welcome on that course?
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I convene that course on behalf of pretty much everyone who's on this panel, because many of us either contribute directly or their research contributes directly. So maybe, Saul, if I could just take a moment and just work through the bushfire curriculum sort of framework, if you like, in the Fenner School. And this is open to undergraduate and graduate students alike. So there is a graduate version of many of these courses that I will talk about. The assessment is different. It's at a much higher level, as you would expect, and it's a more in-depth exploration, a more tailored exploration of the bushfire discipline, if you like, for the particular graduate student. So these comments are both for the undergraduate and graduate students or potential students on this conference call. So there's two main bushfire courses, but bushfire knowledge is taught into a lot of our courses, and you've picked that up already through Phil's courses and David's work in conservation, biodiversity, and Saul's courses that Marta's teaching and the like. In first year, bushfires feature on a specialist panel in our course, Environment, Society, Geography of Sustainability. And here we look at Australian bushfire history, dynamics and effects of bushfires and environment society, just like we're doing today. This could be very much like that panel and a discussion with graduate students in that panel. In second year, and for sort of mid-ranging graduate students, if you like, we run a course called Fire, Flood and Drought. And this course focuses on exploring extreme bushfire and climate and weather events and the underpinning science to understand these dynamics. So for the bushfires, we learn about many of the extreme bushfire events we've talked about already in this panel, but to understand why those occur and where they occur, we think about fire weather, climate drivers, learn about bushfire fuel dynamics, terrain effects, predicting fire behaviour and bushfire suppression. And that leads into our advanced bushfire course, which is called Fire and the Environment, which will next run in 2020. And Phil teaches in this course, Marta does, a lot of David's research contributes to this course, and Saul's. And this course explores solutions to bushfire problems in biodiversity management, bushfire prevention, climate effects on bushfires, rebuilding society after bushfires, bushfire arson, for example. And you know, we use knowledge generated and we conduct experiments and we explore knowledge from ecosystem science, Indigenous fire knowledge. I talked about our field trip out with the Murrumbung Rangers, bushfire law. We have one of Australia's leading bushfire lawyers that teaches in the course, computer modelling, social science and bushfire laboratory experiments. So to go back to your question, Saul, about field trips, in that course in particular, we spend time up in the high country in the ACT looking at the regeneration after the 2003 and now the 2019-2020 bushfires. We visit CSIRO bushfires, their laboratory, bushfire laboratory, and conduct experiments in their horizontal and vertical wind tunnels. We spend an afternoon on Black Mountain, which you can see over my shoulder there, that has a very rich history of bushfires and lots of interesting fire ecological effects that Phil and David have already talked about, and we can see those patterns from satellite using the sorts of knowledge that Marta has introduced us to. So there's our bushfire curriculum in the Fenner School.
I think one important thing about our courses that students love, I think Geoff would support me in this, and Saul, that we take them into the field a lot. We do a lot of field work and students love that. You get out of the lecture theatre, it's not all theory, it's seeing things in action. And I think most of our courses get out and about quite a lot during the week, and Canberra is so great for that. You know, I've got a colleague, not that I want to diss University of Melbourne, our competition, but I've got a colleague at University of Melbourne. They said they can't go outside of Melbourne for a field trip because of the traffic. So theirs is the only outdoor exercise they do is in Royal Park. So, you know, we go out and about all the time. We're so lucky in Canberra because we don't have that traffic problem. The city comes, the bush comes right down to the city. So it's fantastic teaching here.
And part of what you can hear in these answers is it's not just the students that appreciate it, but I think everyone who's teaching a course loves the opportunity to get outside, and that makes you a more enjoyable teacher to be with. David, you made a comment before about connecting with people when you're out in the field and how that might relate to employment. I want to use that as a opportunity to ask a question about how a Fenner education, especially around fire, might set you up for future employment and professional prospects. We've got one more question in the Q&A coming, but let's ask the employment question first.
Well, a lot of the courses that are taught in Fenner, and then people that might go on and do postgraduate work, end up working in places that are managed by agencies or other kinds of organisations, and that means that connects people to potential employers, be it Parks Australia, local land services, catchment management authorities, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, state and federal governments, and just being, you get a sense of what the opportunities are, who might be the key people to talk to, all those kinds of things. So a very, very good record in the Fenner School of our graduates going on to work in the area of environmental science and management.
In fact, Adam Leavesey, another person, we mentioned Biami before as a former graduate of the Fenner School, who'd like to talk about Adam and what his job is now.
Marta and I both collaborate closely with Adam. Marta.
Yes, well, Adam is now one of the lead users of our project, Geoff, and my own project. He's a graduate student from Fenner who also did a PhD afterwards. And now he's the bushfire research utilization manager of ACT Parks and Conservation Service. So basically, his role is to make sure the agency uses the latest research to inform the decisions. So I guess it's a very exciting kind of job.
I think Adam finds it a very engaging job, Marta. It's all I can contribute. I spent a little bit of time, I actually walked into work across Black Mountain this morning, and I spent a little bit of time thinking about some of our bushfire course graduates and where they are. The director of the Western Australian Office of Bushfire Risk Management was a graduate of our Fenner School bushfire courses. The Bushfire Research Utilisation Manager in ACT Parks and Conservation, we've just heard. The Planning Manager for the Tasmanian Fire Services Fuel Reduction Prescribed Burning Unit, including providing expertise in Canada as a fire behaviour analyst. Indigenous Project Officer in the Mulligan Flat Woodland Sanctuary, which is a very important research site for the ACT government and the Fenner School and internationally renowned. And that graduate was also awarded the ACT NAIDOC Caring for Country Award in 2019. A consultant with Mulligan Group, which is a private consulting group which provides innovative solutions to greenhouse gas emission problems in natural systems. And that graduate was an author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change guidelines in relevant work, and worked for the Australian Government, former Department of Climate Change and Energy. And also some recent graduates working on our fire, fuel and fauna project in Booderee National Park that David mentioned before. So there's some graduates who I remember asking great questions in classes, getting really rewarding jobs and helping Australia manage the bushfire problem.
Isn't that a fantastic list of people? And I think, you know, when you know that there's that many people who have learned about fire at Fenner School and then gone on and become fire professionals, if you like. But then, of course, there's many others who might have gone on to become a high school teacher or a public servant in the Department of Agriculture or whatever, and they still take that knowledge with them. And I think we, you know, there's huge value in in learning about environment issues, even for people who aren't specifically wanting to become, you know, in an environment-specific career path, and I think we try to teach that way. Now we're getting a little bit towards the end, and there is one question that's come in I wanted to ask. So I don't direct it to all of us, I guess. Do you do any work with the AWC? In fact, David mentioned them a moment ago. Large land management projects, fire management, ecology, etc. So, well, anyone can pick it up, but David, I think, will have something to say there.
Yeah, the answer is yes. One of our PhD graduates was recently working with them, and as she had some good experiences with them. AWC is connected very closely to the Fenner School through the Threatened Species Recovery Hub, and the former CEO of AWC is now working as a secretary of a department in New South Wales, and is asking the Fenner School on a regular basis for advice on monitoring, and of course post-fire monitoring of biodiversity is a critical thing in that space. In that particular circumstance, he's very interested in what's the effect of populations of feral horses on post-fire recovery of alpine ecosystems. So the answer to your question is yes, there are very strong links, both directly and indirectly, with organisations like AWC, but many others, Bush Heritage Australia, Parks Australia, etc.
And as we come towards the end, for anyone who might want to learn more about bushfire issues, and particularly David's work in bushfires, we haven't spoken much, for example, about David's work in the interactions between forestry practice and bushfires. People might want to learn more about that. We have a session on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Hopefully you're aware of that, David.
Yes, I've written my talk several times and then rewritten it.
So that should be another great session for people who have those interests. We've only got a few moments left, and we've covered a lot of what I wanted to talk about, but does anyone have any thoughts they wanted to add before we leave our audience behind?
So could I also do a bit of cross promotion? So at 2 p.m. this afternoon, as part of ANU Open Day, we'll be tracking a possum as part of some research that we were doing live. So tracking where it's sleeping today, and talking about why we're doing that and what that research is all about.
That sounds fantastic. Although I don't imagine the possum's going to move very far in the course of the session, but still we'll know where he is, or she.
We'll find out where it is today.
Any other comments from any other panelists? Okay, all right, so our attendees, it's your very last chance to ask a question quickly in the chat or the Q&A function. If nothing comes in the next minute or so, then we'll just wrap it up and say thank you. Okay, I can't see. Oh, here we go. All right. A few words on research from space. So I've already talked a bit about research from space. Anything missing from our research from space conversation, Marta?
Well, perhaps I didn't mention that you can also, of course, track active fires from space. I think I told on the fire risk prediction and the post-fire assessment of the effects of the fires, but satellites can also be used for active fire detection. Basically, they detect for a change in the temperature in the landscape, and that is identified as a fire. And this is, of course, very important for early response. So the earlier you detect a fire, the earlier you can respond.
And is there a possibility that that would replace the traditional system of having fire towers and people with binoculars?
I think at the end of the day, it needs to be an integration of methods. So yeah, we call this the ideal wedding cake. So with different layers, no? So you need some sensors on the ground to detect a very small fire, because ultimately the satellites may detect a fire that is perhaps a bit too large to put off very quickly. So yeah, I guess what we are now putting an initiative at the ANU that is called the Bushfire Initiative, where we are planning to integrate different remote sensing techniques, from sensors on the ground to cameras in towers to UAVs, giving a bit of a more view of the landscape to satellites in a geostationary orbit, to look constantly to the same spot of the land, but at a larger scale and less detail.
Great. Thanks for that. Look, thanks to all the panelists for their contribution today. Thanks to all the attendees who came along to learn about fire, but also about studying at the ANU and especially studying in the Fenner School. And I encourage you to learn more about all the different parts of the ANU, and I strongly encourage you to become an ANU student, and hopefully we will see you one day in reality rather than just in a Zoom conference. Thanks a lot for coming, everyone.